Question 1. Assessment of a manufacturing facility's emergency planning and community right to know Act EPCRA compliance processes, specifically regarding the accuracy and timeliness of Tier Roman II reporting for hazardous substances, would best be achieved by Option A. Evaluating the effectiveness of the company's internal procedures for identifying, quantifying, and reporting EPCRA-regulated chemicals, including data management and personnel training. Option B. Reviewing the facility's compliance records for hazardous waste management under ARCRA to ensure alignment with EPCRA reporting. Option C. Verifying that Tier Roman II reports were submitted to the relevant state and local authorities before the annual deadline. Option D. Confirming that the company possesses up-to-date safety data sheets, SDS, for all chemicals stored on-site. The correct answer is A. Evaluating the effectiveness of the company's internal procedures for identifying, quantifying, and reporting EPCRA-regulated chemicals, including data management and personnel training. Explanation: Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common challenge for environmental, health and safety auditors, ensuring compliance with complex reporting requirements under the Emergency Planning and Community Right to Know Act EPCRA, when a company's operations involve hazardous substances. The challenge lies in the nuanced interpretation of reporting thresholds, the accurate classification of chemicals, and the timely submission of accurate data. Auditors must not only verify that reporting has occurred, but also assess the effectiveness and efficiency of the processes used to generate that reporting, especially when dealing with multiple facilities and diverse chemical inventories. The potential for significant penalties and reputational damage underscores the need for rigorous and insightful auditing. Correct approach analysis. The most effective approach involves a comprehensive review of the company's internal processes for identifying reportable chemicals, determining quantities, and managing the submission of Tier Roman II reports. This includes examining the data management systems, the training provided to personnel responsible for EPCRA compliance, and the internal audit or verification procedures in place. By focusing on process optimization, the auditor can identify systemic weaknesses that might lead to non-compliance or inefficient reporting. This proactive stance not only ensures current compliance, but also helps the company improve its EHS management system, thereby preventing future issues. This aligns with the spirit of EPCRA, which aims to provide communities with information about hazardous substances and encourage preparedness. Incorrect approach is analysis. One incorrect approach is to solely focus on whether Tier Roman II reports were submitted by the deadline. While submission is a requirement, this narrow focus ignores the accuracy and completeness of the data, as well as the underlying processes. A company could submit a report on time, but with significant errors or omissions, leading to a false sense of security and potential regulatory violations. This approach fails to identify systemic issues that could lead to future noncompliance. Another incorrect approach is to only review the chemical inventory lists without cross-referencing them against the actual quantities stored on-site throughout the reporting year. EPCRA reporting is based on maximum daily amounts stored. Simply having a list of chemicals does not guarantee accurate reporting if the quantities fluctuate significantly and are not properly tracked for reporting purposes. This oversight can lead to underreporting or overreporting, both of which have implications. A third incorrect approach is to assume that compliance with other environmental regulations, such as those under ARCRA, Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, automatically satisfies EPCRA reporting obligations. While there can be overlap in chemical identification, EPCRA has specific reporting thresholds and requirements that are distinct from waste management regulations. Relying on other regulatory compliance without a specific EPCRA review is a critical failure. Professional reasoning. When faced with such a scenario, an EHS auditor should employ a risk-based approach. This involves understanding the company's operations, identifying potential EPCRA reportable chemicals, and then focusing audit efforts on areas with the highest risk of noncompliance. The auditor should engage with key personnel responsible for EHS and chemical inventory management to understand their processes. The audit should then involve a detailed examination of these processes, including data collection, calculation of thresholds, and report generation. Verification should include sampling of data and comparison with site records. The ultimate goal is to provide actionable recommendations for improvement, not just to identify violations. This systematic and process-oriented approach ensures a thorough and effective audit that adds value to the organization. Question 2. Comparative studies suggest that the effectiveness of environmental site assessments and subsequent remediation efforts can be significantly influenced by the initial approach to site investigation. An EHSA is tasked with evaluating a former industrial facility suspected of soil and groundwater contamination. The site has a complex history of chemical usage and disposal. The auditor needs to determine the most appropriate initial steps to take to accurately characterize the extent and nature of any contamination, while ensuring regulatory compliance and minimizing immediate environmental risks. Option A. Develop and implement a phased site investigation plan, starting with a thorough review of historical records, interviews with knowledgeable personnel, and a preliminary site walkover to identify potential source areas, followed by targeted sampling and analysis based on the findings. Option B. Rely solely on publicly available environmental databases and previous site reports, without conducting any on-site investigations or sampling. Option C. Recommend immediate excavation of suspected contaminated areas for off-site disposal, assuming the worst-case scenario to expedite the remediation process. Option D. Initiate immediate intrusive soil sampling and groundwater monitoring across the entire property based on a general understanding of historical operations, without a detailed site-specific investigation plan. The correct answer is D. Initiate immediate intrusive soil sampling and groundwater monitoring across the entire property based on a general understanding of historical operations, without a detailed site-specific investigation plan. Explanation: this scenario is professionally challenging because it requires an environmental health and safety auditor, EHSA, to balance the immediate need for site access and data collection with the potential for significant environmental impact and regulatory noncompliance. The auditor must exercise careful judgment to ensure that investigative activities do not exacerbate existing contamination or create new hazards, while also adhering to the strict requirements of the relevant regulatory framework. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes a thorough, risk-based site assessment before any intrusive remediation activities commence. This aligns with the principles of due diligence and responsible environmental management mandated by regulatory bodies. Specifically, it ensures that the auditor's actions are guided by a comprehensive understanding of the site's conditions, potential hazards, and the legal obligations for investigation and remediation. This systematic approach minimizes the risk of further environmental damage, protects human health, and ensures that any subsequent remediation efforts are targeted, effective, and compliant with all applicable laws and guidelines. An incorrect approach that involves immediate, uncoordinated excavation without prior characterization would represent a significant regulatory failure. This would violate the precautionary principle, which is often embedded in environmental legislation, requiring proactive measures to prevent harm. It could also contravene specific regulations concerning the handling of potentially contaminated materials, waste disposal, and the notification requirements for discovering hazardous substances. Ethically, such an approach demonstrates a lack of professional responsibility and a disregard for the potential harm to the environment and public health. Another incorrect approach, such as relying solely on historical data without on-site verification, would also be professionally unacceptable. While historical data is valuable, it may not reflect current site conditions or account for unforeseen contamination pathways. This could lead to an incomplete or inaccurate assessment, resulting in ineffective remediation strategies and continued environmental risk, thereby failing to meet the auditor's duty of care and potentially violating regulatory mandates for accurate site characterization. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a phased approach. 1. Initial site reconnaissance and review of available data to identify potential areas of concern. 2. Development of a detailed site investigation plan that outlines sampling strategies, analytical methods, and safety protocols, ensuring it aligns with regulatory requirements. 3. Execution of the site investigation, prioritizing safety and environmental protection. 4. Comprehensive data analysis and risk assessment to inform remediation decisions. 5. Development and implementation of a remediation plan that is technically sound, cost-effective, and compliant with all applicable regulations. Throughout this process, Clear communication with stakeholders and adherence to ethical principles are paramount. Question 3. The control framework reveals that a significant renovation project is planned for a pre-1980s commercial building. The project scope includes extensive interior demolition and refurbishment. As an environmental, health and safety auditor (EHSA), what is the most appropriate initial step to ensure compliance with asbestos and lead regulations, considering the potential for these hazardous materials to be present in the building's structure and finishes? Option A. Advise the project team to implement enhanced general dust suppression measures throughout the renovation area to minimize airborne particulate matter. Option B. Recommend a visual inspection by the site supervisor to identify any obviously damaged or deteriorating materials that might contain asbestos or lead. Option C. Proceed with the renovation assuming that due to the building's age, asbestos and lead are unlikely to be present in significant quantities, and focus on general site safety protocols. Option D. Mandate a comprehensive pre-demolition survey conducted by a licensed asbestos surveyor and a certified lead inspector to identify and quantify any asbestos-containing materials (ACM) and lead-based paint (LBP), followed by the engagement of licensed contractors for any necessary abatement. The correct answer is D. Mandate a comprehensive pre-demolition survey conducted by a licensed asbestos surveyor and a certified lead inspector to identify and quantify any asbestos-containing materials (ACM) and lead-based paint (LBP), followed by the engagement of licensed contractors for any necessary abatement. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires an environmental, health and safety auditor (EHSA) to navigate the complex interplay between historical building materials, potential exposure risks, and the legal obligations for managing these hazards. The challenge lies in accurately assessing the scope of work, identifying the specific regulatory requirements applicable to the identified materials, and ensuring that the proposed remediation strategy aligns with these stringent standards, all while operating within the defined jurisdiction of the EHSA exam. Misinterpreting the regulatory landscape or underestimating the risks associated with asbestos and lead can lead to significant health consequences for workers and the public, as well as severe legal and financial penalties for the organization. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it directly addresses the core regulatory requirements for managing asbestos and lead in a building renovation context. Specifically, it mandates a thorough pre-demolition survey by a licensed professional to identify the presence and location of asbestos-containing materials (ACM) and lead-based paint (LBP). This aligns with the fundamental principle of hazard identification and risk assessment mandated by regulations such as the Control of Asbestos Regulations 2012, UK, and EPA's Lead Renovation, Repair and Painting (RRP) Rule, US. Depending on the specified jurisdiction, the requirement for a licensed contractor to perform any necessary abatement work ensures that the removal and disposal are conducted by trained individuals following established safety protocols, minimizing exposure and environmental contamination. This systematic, legally compliant approach prioritizes worker and public safety and environmental protection, which are the primary objectives of EHSA auditing. Incorrect approaches analysis. An approach that focuses solely on visual inspection without professional testing for asbestos or lead is professionally unacceptable. This fails to meet the regulatory requirement for definitive identification of these hazardous materials. Visual inspection alone cannot confirm the presence of asbestos fibers or lead in paint, leading to a false sense of security and potential exposure. This constitutes a significant regulatory failure by neglecting mandated testing protocols. An approach that relies on general dust control measures without specific protocols for asbestos or lead abatement is also professionally unacceptable. While general dust control is important, it is insufficient to manage the specific risks posed by friable asbestos or lead dust generated during renovation. Regulations require specialized containment, ventilation, and cleaning procedures for these materials, which general dust control measures do not provide. This represents a failure to implement legally required specific abatement procedures. An approach that assumes the absence of asbestos and lead based on the building's age without any form of survey or testing is a critical regulatory and ethical failure. Many older buildings, even those constructed after certain bans, may still contain these hazardous materials. This assumption bypasses the legally mandated due diligence required to identify and manage these risks, potentially exposing individuals to severe health hazards and the organization to legal repercussions. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a systematic, risk-based approach that prioritizes regulatory compliance and hazard identification. This involves 1. Understanding the specific regulatory framework applicable to the jurisdiction and the type of work being undertaken. 2. Conducting thorough pre-work assessments, including professional surveys and testing, to identify all potential hazards. 3. Developing and implementing specific control measures and abatement plans that directly address the identified hazards and comply with all legal requirements. 4. Ensuring that all work is performed by qualified and licensed professionals. 5. Maintaining comprehensive documentation of all assessments, plans, and work performed. This structured process ensures that all legal obligations are met and that the highest standards of health, safety, and environmental protection are maintained. Question 4. To address the challenge of ensuring accurate toxic release inventory, reporting for a manufacturing facility, an Environmental Health and Safety Auditor (EHSA) is reviewing the site's operations. The facility manufactures and uses several chemicals that appear on the TRI list. Which of the following approaches best ensures compliance with TRI regulations? Option A. Reviewing the facility's existing TRI reports from previous years and assuming current operations are consistent. Option B. Focusing only on chemicals explicitly identified by the facility's management as being subject to TRI reporting. Option C. Conducting a comprehensive review of all chemicals manufactured, processed, or otherwise used at the facility, comparing quantities against TRI reporting thresholds, and identifying all relevant release and waste management activities. Option D. Assuming that any chemical present on the TRI list, regardless of quantity or how it is used, must be reported. The correct answer is A. Reviewing the facility's existing TRI reports from previous years and assuming current operations are consistent. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge for an Environmental Health and Safety Auditor (EHSA) due to the inherent complexity of identifying and reporting toxic chemical releases under the Toxic Release Inventory program. The challenge lies in accurately determining which chemicals manufactured, processed, or otherwise used at a facility meet the TRI reporting thresholds, and then ensuring the reported data is complete and accurate. Misinterpretation of chemical usage, processing thresholds, or exemptions can lead to significant compliance failures, including fines, reputational damage, and potential harm to human health and the environment. The auditor must possess a deep understanding of the TRI regulations, including specific chemical lists, threshold quantities, and reporting requirements, as well as the facility's operations. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a systematic and thorough review of the facility's chemical inventory, process descriptions, and waste management practices, cross-reference with the Environmental Protection Agency's EPA TRI reporting requirements. This includes identifying all chemicals that are on the TRI list and determining if they are manufactured, processed, or otherwise used above the applicable reporting thresholds. The auditor must also investigate potential exemptions and ensure that all relevant data, such as quantities released, treated, and recycled, are accurately captured and reported. This meticulous, data-driven approach aligns with the EHSA ethical and professional obligation to ensure compliance with environmental regulations, thereby protecting public health and the environment. It reflects best professional practice by prioritizing accuracy, completeness, and adherence to the specific mandates of the TRI program. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach is to rely solely on the facility's self-reported data without independent verification. This fails to uphold the auditor's responsibility to provide an objective assessment and could perpetuate reporting errors or omissions. Ethically, it undermines the integrity of the audit process. Legally, it could lead to the submission of inaccurate TRI reports, violating the Emergency Planning and Community Right No Act (EPCRA), Section 313. Another incorrect approach is to assume that if a chemical is on the TRI list, it automatically requires reporting, regardless of the quantities used or processed. This demonstrates a lack of understanding of the TRI reporting thresholds, which are a critical component of the regulation. This oversight can lead to unnecessary reporting burdens or, conversely, missed reporting obligations if thresholds are indeed met. It represents a failure to apply the specific regulatory criteria for TRI reporting. A third incorrect approach is to overlook chemicals that are present in waste streams or are byproducts of processes, assuming they are not subject to TRI reporting if not explicitly listed as a primary input. The TRI regulations encompass releases from all aspects of a facility's operations, including waste management. Failing to consider these sources is a significant regulatory failure and a breach of professional duty to conduct a comprehensive audit. Professional reasoning. EHSA professionals should approach TRI compliance audits by first thoroughly understanding the specific facility's operations and chemical usage. This involves detailed site inspections, interviews with relevant personnel, and a comprehensive review of all chemical-related documentation. The auditor must then meticulously compare this operational data against the current EPA TRI chemical list and reporting thresholds. A robust audit process will involve verifying data through multiple sources, including purchase orders, inventory records, process flow diagrams, and waste manifests. When in doubt about a chemical's reporting status, the auditor should consult the EPA's TRI guidance documents or seek clarification from regulatory agencies. The decision-making process should prioritize accuracy, completeness, and adherence to the letter and spirit of the TRI regulations, ensuring that the facility meets its legal obligations and contributes to transparent environmental reporting. Question 5. Risk assessment procedures indicate that a facility proposes to modify an existing process unit. The proposed modification involves installing new equipment and altering operational parameters. The EHSA must determine if this modification triggers the need for a prevention of significant deterioration (PSD) permit. Which of the following actions is the most appropriate initial step for the EHSA to take in assessing this requirement? Option A. Review the capital expenditure associated with the proposed modification to determine if it exceeds a predetermined threshold for significant investment, which often correlates with major changes. Option B. Assume that any modification to an existing process unit, regardless of the magnitude of potential emissions changes, requires a PSD permit to ensure full compliance. Option C. Quantitatively estimate the potential increase in actual or potential emissions for all regulated pollutants from the proposed modification, and compare these increases against the significant emissions increase thresholds defined in the applicable PSD regulations. Option D. Consult general industry guidelines for air pollution control to identify common practices for emissions reduction that would likely satisfy regulatory expectations for any modification. The correct answer is C. Quantitatively estimate the potential increase in actual or potential emissions for all regulated pollutants from the proposed modification, and compare these increases against the significant emissions increase thresholds defined in the applicable PSD regulations. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires an environmental health and safety auditor, EHSA, to interpret and apply complex regulatory requirements for prevention of significant deterioration, PSD, in a context where a proposed modification to an existing facility might trigger new source review. The challenge lies in accurately assessing whether the proposed changes meet the threshold for a PSD permit, which involves understanding potential emissions increases and the applicable new source performance standards, NSPS, and national emission standards for hazardous air pollutants, NESHAP. Misinterpreting these thresholds can lead to significant noncompliance, environmental harm, and substantial penalties. The auditor must exercise careful judgment to distinguish between routine maintenance, minor modifications, and changes that constitute a major modification or new source under PSD regulations. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a thorough review of the proposed project's potential to increase actual or potential emissions of regulated pollutants. This requires consulting the specific PSD regulations, e.g., 40 CFR Part 52 in the U.S., to determine the significant emissions increase thresholds for each regulated pollutant. The auditor must then compare the projected emissions increase from the proposed project against these thresholds. If the projected increase for any regulated pollutant exceeds its significant emissions increase threshold, the project will likely be considered a major modification or a new source, requiring a PSD permit. This approach is best professional practice because it directly aligns with the regulatory intent of PSD, which is to ensure that air quality is not significantly deteriorated by new or modified major stationary sources. It is a proactive, data-driven assessment that adheres strictly to the established legal framework. Incorrect approach is analysis. An incorrect approach would be to assume that any modification to an existing facility automatically requires a PSD permit without a quantitative assessment of potential emissions increases. This fails to recognize that PSD regulations are triggered by specific thresholds of emissions increases, not by the mere act of modification. Ethically and regulatorily, this is flawed as it imposes unnecessary burdens and misinterprets the law. Another incorrect approach would be to focus solely on the capital cost of the proposed project rather than its potential emissions impact. While cost can be a factor in defining a project, the primary trigger for PSD review is the emissions increase. Ignoring emissions data in favor of cost analysis is a direct violation of the regulatory framework and demonstrates a lack of understanding of PSD's core purpose. A further incorrect approach would be to rely on general industry best practices or internal company policies for emissions control without verifying their compliance with specific PSD requirements and thresholds. While good practices are important, they do not substitute for a formal assessment against legally mandated permit requirements. This approach risks overlooking specific pollutants or emission levels that trigger PSD review, leading to noncompliance. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a systematic approach that begins with understanding the specific regulatory requirements of PSD as defined by the relevant environmental agency. This involves identifying all regulated pollutants and their respective significant emissions increase thresholds. The next step is to gather detailed information about the proposed project, including process changes, equipment modifications, and operational adjustments, to estimate potential emissions increases. This estimation should be based on reliable data, emission factors, and engineering calculations. The auditor must then compare these estimated increases against the regulatory thresholds. If a threshold is met or exceeded, the auditor must then guide the client through the subsequent steps of the PSD permitting process, which may include best available control technology, BACT, analysis, and ambient air quality impact assessments. This structured, evidence-based process ensures compliance and protects environmental quality. Question 6. Market research demonstrates that a manufacturing facility is planning a significant upgrade to its production line, involving the replacement of several older pieces of equipment with newer, more efficient models. The facility manager informs the Environmental, Health and Safety Auditor, EHSA, that while the overall production capacity might increase slightly, they believe the upgrade will not trigger new source review, NSR, because the new equipment is more energy efficient and they intend to operate within their existing permit limits. The EHSA needs to determine if NSR is required. Which of the following approaches is the most appropriate for the EHSA to take? Option A. The EHSA should accept the facility manager's assurance that they will operate within existing permit limits and conclude that NSR is not applicable, as the intent to comply is sufficient. Option B. The EHSA should focus on whether the same type of equipment is being replaced, assuming that if the function remains the same, emissions will not significantly change and NSR is unlikely to be triggered. Option C. The EHSA should review the total capital expenditure for the upgrade project, as projects exceeding a certain cost threshold are typically subject to NSR. Option D. The EHSA should request detailed information on the potential emissions from each new piece of equipment. Compare these potential emissions to the facility's existing permit limits and calculate the projected net change in emissions for all regulated pollutants to determine if a significant net increase, as defined by the relevant regulations, will occur. The correct answer is D. The EHSA should request detailed information on the potential emissions from each new piece of equipment, compare these potential emissions to the facility's existing permit limits, and calculate the projected net change in emissions for all regulated pollutants to determine if a significant net increase, as defined by the relevant regulations, will occur. Explanation. This scenario presents a common challenge for environmental, health and safety auditors, EHSA, when a facility proposes a modification that could potentially trigger new source review, NSR, requirements. The professional challenge lies in accurately assessing the potential for a major modification without over- or underregulating the facility's activities. This requires a nuanced understanding of the specific regulatory definitions and thresholds, as well as the ability to interpret operational data and project plans. Careful judgment is essential to ensure compliance without imposing unnecessary burdens. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it directly addresses the core of NSR applicability, determining if the proposed change will result in a significant net increase in regulated pollutants. This involves a thorough, data-driven assessment of potential emissions, comparing them against established significance levels. By focusing on the actual potential to emit and considering the project's scope, the auditor adheres to the principles of regulatory accuracy and proportionality. This aligns with the ethical obligation to uphold environmental laws and ensure that facilities undertake necessary reviews and controls when their emissions impact air quality. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on the capital expenditure of the project fails to recognize that NSR applicability is driven by potential emissions, not cost. This represents a significant regulatory failure, as it ignores the fundamental purpose of NSR, which is to control air pollution. Ethically, it could be seen as a dereliction of duty to allow a project with potentially significant emissions impacts to proceed without proper review. Another incorrect approach that relies on a general statement of intent to comply without a concrete emissions assessment is also professionally unacceptable. This demonstrates a lack of due diligence and an abdication of the auditor's responsibility to verify compliance. It creates a loophole for potential noncompliance and fails to provide the necessary assurance that the facility's actions will meet regulatory standards. A third incorrect approach that assumes no change in emissions because existing equipment is being replaced is flawed. NSR regulations often require a comparison of potential to emit before and after the change, even if the same type of equipment is used. The potential for increased efficiency or different operating parameters could lead to higher emissions, necessitating a review. This approach risks overlooking actual emission increases and failing to trigger necessary control measures. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve 1. Clearly identifying the proposed project or modification. 2. Consulting the specific regulatory framework, e.g., Clean Air Act in the U.S., or equivalent in other specified jurisdictions, for definitions of major modification and significant net increase. 3. Gathering all relevant operational data, including current and projected emissions, equipment specifications, and operating schedules. 4. Performing a quantitative assessment of potential emissions increases, comparing them against established significance levels. 5. Documenting the entire assessment process and the rationale for the determination of NSR applicability. 6. Communicating findings clearly and transparently to the facility and relevant regulatory bodies. Question 7. The evaluation methodology shows a discrepancy in the facility's record-keeping for refrigerants used in its cooling systems, with some older units containing substances identified as controlled under the Montreal Protocol. Which of the following approaches best addresses this finding from an environmental, health, and safety auditor's perspective, ensuring compliance with the protocol's objectives? Option A. Recommend a general review of the facility's waste disposal procedures to ensure all discarded materials, including refrigerants, are handled according to standard environmental guidelines. Option B. Advise management to prioritize the replacement of older cooling units based on energy efficiency, without specifically detailing the ODS content or its regulatory implications. Option C. Review the facility's existing maintenance logs for the cooling systems to confirm that routine servicing has been performed, assuming this implicitly covers regulatory compliance for refrigerants. Option D. Verify the current inventory of all identified ozone-depleting substances against the Montreal Protocol's phase-out schedules and national regulations, assessing the quantity and type of substances remaining, and recommending a plan for their responsible management or phase-out. The correct answer is D. Verify the current inventory of all identified ozone-depleting substances against the Montreal Protocol's phase-out schedules and national regulations, assessing the quantity and type of substances remaining, and recommending a plan for their responsible management or phase-out. Explanation. The evaluation methodology shows a potential noncompliance with the Montreal Protocol, specifically concerning the management of ozone-depleting substances, ODS, within a facility. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires an EHSA to not only identify the issue, but also to accurately assess the impact and recommend appropriate corrective actions within the strict confines of the Montreal Protocol and its implementing regulations. The auditor must demonstrate a deep understanding of the protocol's objectives, phase-out schedules, and reporting requirements, while also considering the practical implications for the organization. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it directly addresses the core requirements of the Montreal Protocol by focusing on the identification, quantification, and responsible management of ODS. This aligns with the protocol's aim to reduce and eventually eliminate the production and consumption of substances that deplete the ozone layer. By prioritizing the verification of ODS inventory against regulatory limits and phase-out schedules, the auditor ensures that the organization is not only compliant, but also actively contributing to global environmental protection efforts. This proactive stance is ethically sound and professionally responsible, safeguarding both the environment and the organization's reputation. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on general waste management practices fails to acknowledge the specific, stringent regulations governing ODS under the Montreal Protocol. This is a regulatory failure because it overlooks the unique environmental threat posed by ODS and the specific control measures mandated by the protocol. Ethically, it demonstrates a lack of due diligence and a disregard for the specialized knowledge required of an EHSA. Another incorrect approach that prioritizes cost-saving measures without a thorough assessment of ODS impact is also professionally unacceptable. This represents an ethical failure as it places financial considerations above environmental protection and regulatory compliance. It is a regulatory failure because it risks continued noncompliance and potential penalties, undermining the very purpose of the Montreal Protocol. A third incorrect approach that relies on outdated ODS management plans without verifying their current relevance to the Montreal Protocol's evolving phase-out schedules is a significant professional and regulatory failure. This approach demonstrates a lack of critical evaluation and a failure to stay abreast of regulatory changes, which is a core responsibility of an EHSA. It is ethically problematic as it could lead to continued noncompliance and environmental harm. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a systematic review of the relevant regulatory framework, in this case, the Montreal Protocol and its national implementing legislation. The auditor must then gather evidence to assess compliance against these specific requirements. This involves understanding the scope of regulated substances, applicable phase-out timelines, reporting obligations, and any specific control measures for ODS. When an issue is identified, the auditor must prioritize actions that directly address the regulatory noncompliance and its environmental impact, ensuring that recommendations are practical, effective, and aligned with the overarching goals of the environmental legislation. Question 8. Consider a scenario where an environmental, health and safety auditor is reviewing a per-manufacture notification, PMN, for a novel chemical substance submitted under the Toxic Substances Control Act, TSCA. The manufacturer has provided an internal risk assessment that concludes the chemical poses negligible risks. The auditor's task is to evaluate the adequacy of this assessment. Which of the following approaches best aligns with the auditor's responsibilities and TSCA requirements? Option A. Independently evaluate the chemical's potential hazards and exposure pathways, considering all reasonably foreseeable conditions of use and disposal, and compare these findings against established risk assessment methodologies to characterize potential risks to human health and the environment. Option B. Focus the review solely on the chemical's intended commercial application and the manufacturer's stated production volume, assuming that if these are limited, the risk is inherently low. Option C. Accept the manufacturer's internal risk assessment at face value, provided it appears to follow a standard format, as the primary responsibility for risk assessment lies with the submitter. Option D. Prioritize reviewing the chemical's physical and chemical properties without conducting a detailed analysis of potential exposure routes or toxicological endpoints, as this information is foundational. The correct answer is A. Independently evaluate the chemical's potential hazards and exposure pathways, considering all reasonably foreseeable conditions of use and disposal, and compare these findings against established risk assessment methodologies to characterize potential risks to human health and the environment. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because the EHSA auditor must navigate the complexities of the per-manufacture notification (PMN) process under the Toxic Substances Control Act (TSCA) without direct regulatory guidance on the specific risk assessment methodology for a novel chemical. The auditor's judgment is critical in determining if the submitted risk assessment adequately addresses potential environmental and health impacts, especially given the limited historical data for a new substance. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it aligns with the fundamental principles of TSCA and the EPA's mandate to protect human health and the environment. A robust risk assessment, as outlined in the correct option, involves a comprehensive evaluation of exposure pathways, hazard identification, dose-response assessment, and risk characterization. This systematic process ensures that potential risks are identified, quantified, and managed before a new chemical enters commerce. Ethically, this approach upholds the auditor's responsibility to ensure compliance with regulations designed to prevent harm. An incorrect approach that relies solely on the manufacturer's internal risk assessment without independent verification fails to meet the auditor's professional obligations. This represents a regulatory failure because TSCA requires the EPA, and by extension, its auditors, to independently assess the risks of new chemicals. Ethically, it demonstrates a lack of due diligence and a potential abdication of responsibility to protect public health and the environment. Another incorrect approach that focuses only on the intended use of the chemical, neglecting potential unintended exposure scenarios or life cycle impacts, is also professionally unacceptable. This is a regulatory failure, as TSCA scope extends beyond immediate intended uses to encompass all reasonably foreseeable conditions of use and disposal. Ethically, it prioritizes commercial interests over a comprehensive safety evaluation. A third incorrect approach that dismisses potential risks due to the perceived low volume of production is flawed. This is a regulatory failure because TSCA does not establish a de minimis threshold for risk assessment. Even low-volume chemicals can pose significant risks depending on their inherent properties and exposure potential. Ethically, it demonstrates a bias that could lead to the introduction of hazardous substances into the environment. The professional decision-making process for similar situations involves 1. Understanding the specific regulatory requirements, TSCA, EPA guidelines for PMNs. 2. Critically evaluating the manufacturer's submitted data and risk assessment methodology. 3. Identifying potential data gaps or areas of concern. 4. Applying established risk assessment principles to independently verify or supplement the manufacturer's findings. 5. Considering all reasonably foreseeable exposure scenarios and life cycle impacts. 6. Documenting all findings and justifications thoroughly. 7. Communicating concerns and recommendations clearly and professionally. Question 9. The investigation demonstrates that a facility's NPDES permit compliance is being assessed. Which approach would best optimize the facility's environmental performance and proactively identify potential future noncompliance issues related to its wastewater discharges? Option A. Relying solely on the facility's existing standard operating procedures for wastewater management without verifying their practical implementation. Option B. Focusing on the most cost-effective methods for treating wastewater, even if they do not represent the best available technology. Option C. Reviewing historical discharge monitoring reports to confirm that all past permit limits have been met. Option D. Evaluating the effectiveness of current operational controls and identifying opportunities for process improvements that reduce pollutant generation at the source. The correct answer is D. Evaluating the effectiveness of current operational controls and identifying opportunities for process improvements that reduce pollutant generation at the source. Explanation. The investigation demonstrates a common challenge for environmental, health and safety auditors, EHSA, when assessing compliance with the National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System, NPDES, program. The challenge lies in moving beyond a simple check of permit conditions to a more proactive and effective approach that optimizes environmental performance and minimizes risks. Auditors must not only verify adherence to established limits, but also evaluate the underlying processes that influence discharge quality and quantity. This requires a deep understanding of the facility's operations, the specific pollutants of concern, and the best available technologies and management practices. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it aligns with the overarching goals of environmental regulation, which are to protect water quality and public health. By focusing on process optimization, the auditor is not just identifying noncompliance, but actively contributing to preventing future violations and improving the facility's environmental stewardship. This proactive stance is ethically sound, as it prioritizes environmental protection and demonstrates a commitment to continuous improvement, which is often an implicit expectation of professional auditing. Regulatory frameworks, while setting minimum standards, encourage and often reward efforts that go beyond mere compliance. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on historical data without investigating current operational controls is professionally unacceptable. This failure stems from a lack of due diligence and an incomplete assessment of risk. It overlooks the possibility that operational changes, equipment malfunctions, or inadequate maintenance could have led to current or future noncompliance, even if past data appears satisfactory. This approach also fails to identify opportunities for pollution prevention, which is a key tenet of modern environmental management. Another incorrect approach that relies exclusively on readily available, but potentially outdated, standard operating procedures, SOP, without verifying their actual implementation or effectiveness is also professionally deficient. SOPs are only valuable if they are current, comprehensive, and consistently followed. An auditor failing to confirm practical application misses critical insights into operational realities and potential gaps in control. This can lead to a false sense of security regarding compliance. A third incorrect approach that prioritizes the lowest cost of compliance over the effectiveness of pollution control measures is ethically and regulatorily problematic. While cost is a factor in industrial operations, it should never supersede the legal and ethical obligation to protect the environment. This approach can lead to the selection of inadequate or outdated technologies, increasing the risk of permit violations and environmental harm. It demonstrates a failure to uphold the auditor's primary responsibility to ensure environmental protection. Professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a systematic evaluation of the facility's NPDES permit, understanding the specific discharge points and parameters. This should be followed by a thorough review of operational processes, including raw material handling, production methods, waste treatment, and monitoring procedures. The auditor should then assess the effectiveness of existing control measures and identify opportunities for improvement, considering both technological and managerial solutions. This holistic approach ensures a comprehensive and effective audit that supports both compliance and environmental performance. Question 10. Upon reviewing an organization's environmental management system, EMS, documentation, an EHSA is tasked with assessing its effectiveness. Which of the following approaches would best demonstrate a thorough and competent audit of the EMS? Option A. Relying on management's verbal assurances regarding the EMS's integration into daily operations and its contribution to environmental objectives. Option B. Reviewing historical environmental performance reports to confirm past compliance, without a detailed assessment of current operational controls or management system processes. Option C. Verifying the implementation of documented procedures through on-site observations and interviews with operational staff, and analyzing performance data for trends and areas of improvement. Option D. Primarily focusing on the completeness and accuracy of the documented EMS policies and procedures, assuming their implementation is inherent. The correct answer is C. Verifying the implementation of documented procedures through on-site observations and interviews with operational staff, and analyzing performance data for trends and areas of improvement. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common challenge for environmental, health and safety auditors, EHSA, when assessing an organization's environmental management system, EMS. The challenge lies in discerning whether the EMS, while seemingly compliant on paper, is effectively integrated into daily operations and genuinely driving environmental performance improvement, or if it's merely a superficial documentation exercise. The auditor must move beyond a checklist approach to evaluate the system's practical implementation and its impact on the organization's environmental footprint. This requires a deep understanding of the chosen EMS standard, e.g., ISO 14001, if applicable to the exam's jurisdiction, and the ability to critically assess evidence of commitment, operational control, and performance monitoring. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a comprehensive audit that goes beyond mere documentation review. It necessitates on-site verification of operational controls, interviews with personnel at all levels to gauge understanding and commitment to the EMS, and an analysis of performance data to identify trends and areas for improvement. This aligns with the principles of effective EMS implementation, which require top management commitment, clear roles and responsibilities, robust operational procedures, and a cycle of planning, doing, checking, and acting, PDCA. For an EHSA, this means looking for evidence that the EMS is a living system, actively managed and contributing to the organization's environmental objectives and targets, rather than a static set of procedures. This approach ensures the EMS is not just compliant, but also effective in achieving its intended environmental outcomes, which is the ultimate goal of an EMS audit. Incorrect approaches analysis, focusing solely on the documented procedures and policies of the EMS without verifying their implementation in practice, represents a significant failure. This approach risks overlooking critical gaps where procedures are not followed, or where the documented system does not reflect actual operational realities. Ethically, this is a failure to conduct a thorough and competent audit, potentially leading to a false sense of compliance and allowing environmental risks to persist. Accepting management's assurances about the EMS's effectiveness without seeking independent verification or objective evidence is another flawed approach. This relies on subjective statements rather than verifiable facts, undermining the auditor's independence and the integrity of the audit process. It can lead to the perpetuation of non-compliance or ineffective practices, as management may have a vested interest in presenting a positive, albeit inaccurate, picture. Prioritizing the review of historical environmental performance data over the assessment of current operational controls and management system processes is also problematic. While historical data is important for trend analysis, an EMS audit's primary focus is on the system's ability to manage current and future environmental aspects and impacts. Neglecting the assessment of ongoing processes means the auditor is not evaluating the system's proactive capacity to prevent pollution and ensure compliance. Professional reasoning. When faced with assessing an EMS, an EHSA should adopt a risk-based approach. This involves understanding the organization's environmental aspects and impacts, identifying key legal and other requirements, and then focusing audit efforts on the areas where the EMS is most critical for ensuring compliance and driving improvement. The auditor must employ a combination of document review, interviews, and on-site observation to gather sufficient appropriate audit evidence. A critical step is to triangulate information from different sources to validate findings. If discrepancies arise between documented procedures and operational practices, or between management statements and employee feedback, the auditor must investigate further to understand the root cause. This systematic and evidence-based approach ensures the audit is robust, credible, and provides valuable insights for the organization's environmental performance. Question 11. Compliance review shows that a manufacturing facility has historically submitted Tier I and Tier Roman II reports based on the previous year's inventory data and a general understanding of chemicals on site. To optimize the reporting process for the upcoming cycle, which of the following approaches would best ensure regulatory compliance and enhance emergency preparedness? Option A. Continue to rely on the previous year's submitted data as a baseline, making only minor adjustments for obvious changes in chemical usage, and delegate the final review to the purchasing department. Option B. Implement a comprehensive, site-wide chemical inventory audit that cross-references all stored materials against current safety data sheets and regulatory reporting thresholds, establishing a clear internal verification protocol before submission. Option C. Develop a simplified internal checklist based on common chemicals and have the environmental manager complete it without involving other departments or conducting a physical inventory verification. Option D. Focus reporting efforts exclusively on chemicals explicitly identified as hazardous on their safety data sheets, assuming all other stored materials are below reporting thresholds. The correct answer is B. Implement a comprehensive, site-wide chemical inventory audit that cross-references all stored materials against current safety data sheets and regulatory reporting thresholds, establishing a clear internal verification protocol before submission. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the critical nature of Tier I and Tier Roman II reporting, which directly impacts emergency preparedness and public right to know regarding hazardous substances. The auditor must navigate the complexities of identifying all relevant chemicals, accurately determining their quantities, and ensuring timely submission to the appropriate authorities, all while optimizing the reporting process for efficiency and accuracy. The challenge lies in balancing thoroughness with the need for a streamlined, repeatable process that minimizes the risk of errors or omissions. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes a systematic, data-driven review of all chemical inventory records against regulatory thresholds. This ensures that no hazardous substances are overlooked and that the reporting is compliant with the spirit and letter of the law, specifically the Emergency Planning and Community Right to Know Act (EPCRA) in the U.S. By establishing clear internal procedures for data collection, verification, and submission, the organization builds a robust system that can be consistently applied, reducing the likelihood of future noncompliance and enhancing overall EHS management. This proactive stance also fosters a culture of accountability and continuous improvement. An incorrect approach that relies solely on historical reporting data without re-verification is professionally unacceptable. This fails to account for changes in chemical inventory, new substances introduced, or shifts in quantities that may now exceed reporting thresholds. This represents a significant regulatory failure by potentially omitting required reports, thereby undermining emergency responders' ability to plan and react effectively. Ethically, it breaches the duty to provide accurate information to the public and regulatory bodies. Another incorrect approach that focuses only on chemicals explicitly listed on safety data sheets, SDS, without considering all stored materials is also flawed. While SDS are crucial, they may not capture all hazardous substances present, such as those stored in bulk or in intermediate process streams, or those that are mixtures where the hazardous components are not immediately obvious from the primary SDS. This can lead to underreporting, a regulatory failure, and a lack of comprehensive hazard information for emergency planning, which is an ethical lapse. A third incorrect approach that delegates the entire reporting responsibility to a single department without cross-functional oversight or a defined verification process is problematic. This creates a single point of failure and increases the risk of errors or omissions due to a lack of diverse perspectives or checks and balances. While delegation is necessary, it must be accompanied by robust internal controls and accountability mechanisms, the absence of which constitutes a failure in professional due diligence and can lead to regulatory noncompliance. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a thorough understanding of the applicable regulations, e.g., EPCRA in the U.S., a comprehensive inventory of all chemicals on site, a clear methodology for determining reportable quantities, and a system for regular review and updates. Auditors should advocate for process optimization that integrates EHS reporting into broader inventory management systems, leveraging technology where appropriate, and ensuring clear lines of responsibility and accountability. This proactive and systematic approach is key to maintaining compliance and fostering a safe environment. Question 12. Examination of the data shows that a facility operating a solvent degreasing operation has submitted monthly reports indicating that the total volatile organic compound, VOC, emissions are below the general threshold for air permits. However, the facility's process involves the use of a specific chlorinated solvent known to be a hazardous air pollutant, HAP, under the relevant National Emission Standards for Hazardous Air Pollutants, NESHAP, regulations. The submitted data does not specifically identify or quantify the emissions of this chlorinated solvent, only the total VOCs. As an EHSA, what is the most appropriate next step? Option A. Issue a notice of violation based on the assumption that any HAP emission, regardless of total VOC levels, is a violation of NESHAP. Option B. Conclude that the facility is in compliance because the total VOC emissions are below the general air permit threshold, as this indicates good operational control. Option C. Request detailed emission data, specifically for the chlorinated solvent, and verify if the facility is meeting the applicable NESHAP requirements for that specific HAP, which may include emission limits or work practice standards. Option D. Advise the facility to reduce all VOC emissions further to ensure they are well below any potential future regulatory changes, without specifically addressing the chlorinated solvent. Correct answer is C. Request detailed emission data specifically for the chlorinated solvent and verify if the facility is meeting the applicable NESHAP requirements for that specific HAP, which may include emission limits or work practice standards. Explanation: the scenario presents a common challenge for environmental, health, and safety auditors, EHSA, when reviewing data related to air emissions. The core difficulty lies in interpreting potentially ambiguous data against the backdrop of complex regulatory requirements, specifically the National Emission Standards for Hazardous Air Pollutants, NESHAP. The auditor must not only identify potential noncompliance, but also understand the nuances of the regulations to determine the appropriate course of action. This requires a deep understanding of the specific NESHAP subpart applicable to the facility, the definition of a hazardous air pollutant, HAP, under that subpart, and the established emission thresholds or controlled device performance standards. Misinterpreting data or applying the wrong regulatory criteria can lead to incorrect findings, potentially resulting in unnecessary enforcement actions or, conversely, overlooking significant environmental risks. The correct approach involves a meticulous review of the facility's process, the specific NESHAP regulations applicable to that process, and the submitted monitoring data. This includes verifying that the data collection methods comply with regulatory requirements and that the reported emissions are compared against the correct emission limits or work practice standards. Best professional practice dictates that an EHSA should confirm the applicability of the NESHAP, identify the specific HAPs being emitted, and then assess whether the reported emissions exceed the established standards or if control devices are operating within their required parameters. This thorough, data-driven, and regulation-specific approach ensures accurate assessment and upholds the integrity of the audit process. An incorrect approach would be to make a determination based on general knowledge of air pollution without referencing the specific NESHAP. This fails to acknowledge the tailored nature of NESHAP regulations, which often have specific applicability criteria and emission limits for different source categories. Another incorrect approach is to assume compliance based on the absence of explicit exceedances without verifying the completeness and accuracy of the submitted data or the proper functioning of any required emission control equipment. This overlooks the auditor's responsibility to ensure data integrity and operational effectiveness. Furthermore, focusing solely on visible emissions without considering the specific HAPs regulated by the NESHAP would be a significant regulatory failure, as NESHAP targets specific toxic pollutants that may not be visible. Professional decision-making in such situations requires a systematic process. First, clearly identify the relevant regulatory framework, in this case, the specific NESHAP subpart. Second, understand the facility's operations and the potential HAPs involved. Third, critically evaluate the submitted data, including its source, collection methodology, and completeness. Fourth, compare the data against the applicable regulatory requirements, considering any exemptions or alternative compliance options. Finally, document all findings and the basis for any conclusions, ensuring transparency and defensibility. Question 13. Performance analysis shows that a facility is being considered for acquisition, and an environmental, health, and safety auditor (EHSA) is tasked with assessing its environmental compliance and potential liabilities under the Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation, and Liability Act (CERCLA). Which of the following audit approaches best fulfills the auditor's responsibilities in this context? Option A. A comprehensive review of historical site use, including past industrial activities, examination of all available environmental permits and reports, and targeted site investigations to identify any releases or threatened releases of hazardous substances. Option B. An audit focused on identifying immediate operational hazards and ensuring compliance with workplace safety standards, with environmental liability assessment being a secondary consideration. Option C. A review limited to current operational environmental permits and adherence to contemporary state and federal environmental regulations, with no specific focus on historical contamination. Option D. An assessment based primarily on readily accessible public environmental databases and agency records, without conducting in-depth site-specific historical research or physical inspections. Correct answer is A. A comprehensive review of historical site use, including past industrial activities, examination of all available environmental permits and reports, and targeted site investigations to identify any releases or threatened releases of hazardous substances. Explanation: this scenario is professionally challenging because it requires an environmental, health, and safety auditor (EHSA) to navigate the complexities of CERCLA, specifically focusing on the identification and management of hazardous substances at a facility undergoing due diligence for potential acquisition. The challenge lies in ensuring that the audit not only identifies current compliance, but also uncovers historical liabilities that could have significant financial and legal ramifications for the acquiring entity. The auditor must exercise meticulous judgment to distinguish between routine environmental management and the discovery of potential CERCLA reportable releases or conditions. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it directly addresses the core requirements of CERCLA for identifying and assessing potential liabilities. By focusing on a thorough review of historical site use, environmental permits, and any past or present releases of hazardous substances, the auditor is proactively fulfilling the spirit and letter of the law. This diligent investigation is crucial for informing the acquiring party of potential Superfund site implications, enabling informed decision-making regarding the transaction and necessary remediation strategies. This aligns with the professional ethical obligation to provide accurate and comprehensive assessments. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on current operational permits and compliance with general environmental regulations fails to address the historical liability aspect inherent in CERCLA. This is a significant regulatory failure, as it overlooks the potential for past contamination to trigger Superfund obligations, even if current operations are compliant. Ethically, this approach is deficient as it does not provide the acquiring party with a complete picture of environmental risks. Another incorrect approach that relies exclusively on readily available public records without conducting site-specific investigations is also professionally unacceptable. While public records are a starting point, they may not capture all historical activities or subtle indications of contamination. This can lead to a false sense of security and a failure to identify CERCLA-triggering conditions. This represents a regulatory failure by not conducting due diligence commensurate with the potential risks. A third incorrect approach that prioritizes speed and cost-effectiveness over thoroughness, perhaps by limiting the scope of the historical review or the depth of site sampling, is ethically and regulatorily unsound. CERCLA intent is to ensure responsible parties address contamination. An incomplete audit that misses potential Superfund liabilities exposes the acquiring party to unforeseen risks and potential future enforcement actions, violating the auditor's duty of care. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a risk-based approach. EHSA auditors must first understand the regulatory landscape of the jurisdiction, in this case, U.S. CERCLA. They should then develop a detailed audit plan that includes a comprehensive review of historical site use, interviews with long-term employees, examination of past environmental reports, and appropriate site investigations. The scope of the investigation should be proportionate to the perceived risk based on the industry, historical operation, and geographic location. Transparency with the client about the scope, limitations, and potential findings is paramount. Question 14. Strategic planning requires an environmental, health, and safety auditor (EHSA) to consider various perspectives. Which of the following approaches best ensures comprehensive risk identification and effective EHS strategy development from a stakeholder viewpoint? Option A. Engaging with a broad range of stakeholders, including employees, local community representatives, and regulatory bodies, to gather diverse insights on potential EHS impacts and concerns. Option B. Focusing exclusively on documented historical EHS incidents and compliance records to identify areas for improvement. Option C. Prioritizing the perspectives of senior management and operational leads to align EHS goals with immediate business objectives. Option D. Relying solely on the company's internal EHS department's assessment of risks and mitigation measures. The correct answer is C. Prioritizing the perspectives of senior management and operational leads to align EHS goals with immediate business objectives. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because an environmental, health, and safety auditor (EHSA) must balance the immediate operational needs of a company with long-term environmental sustainability and regulatory compliance. The auditor's role is to provide objective assurance, which can be difficult when faced with pressure to prioritize short-term financial gains over robust EHS practices. Careful judgment is required to identify potential risks that might be overlooked by management focused solely on immediate production targets. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it directly addresses the core responsibilities of an EHSA as outlined in relevant regulatory frameworks and professional codes of conduct. By proactively engaging with diverse stakeholders, including employees, local communities, and regulatory bodies, the auditor ensures a comprehensive understanding of potential EHS impacts and concerns. This inclusive approach fosters transparency, builds trust, and allows for the identification of systemic issues that might not be apparent from a purely internal perspective. It aligns with the ethical obligation to protect public health and the environment, and the regulatory requirement to ensure compliance with all applicable environmental and health and safety laws. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on management's immediate financial objectives would be a significant regulatory and ethical failure. It would violate the EHSA duty to uphold environmental protection and worker safety, potentially leading to non-compliance with regulations such as the Health and Safety at Work, etc. Act 1974, UK, or the Occupational Safety and Health Act, US, depending on the specified jurisdiction. Ethically, it would represent a dereliction of duty, prioritizing profit over people and the planet. Another incorrect approach that neglects to consider the perspectives of affected communities would also be professionally unacceptable. This oversight could lead to the identification of risks that disproportionately impact local populations without adequate mitigation strategies, potentially violating principles of environmental justice and community engagement mandated by various environmental protection laws. It also fails to leverage valuable local knowledge that could inform a more effective EHS strategy. Finally, an approach that relies solely on historical data without considering emerging risks or technological advancements would be insufficient. While historical data is important, EHS is a dynamic field. Failing to incorporate forward-looking assessments, such as climate change impacts or new chemical hazards, would be a failure to provide a truly comprehensive audit and could lead to future noncompliance and harm. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a systematic risk assessment framework, incorporating stakeholder analysis, regulatory review, and a forward-looking perspective. EHSA professionals must maintain their independence and objectivity, ensuring that all findings and recommendations are grounded in evidence and aligned with legal and ethical obligations. When faced with conflicting priorities, the auditor should escalate concerns through appropriate channels and advocate for EHS best practices, even if it challenges established operational norms. Question 15. Analysis of a manufacturing facility's proposed process modification reveals a potential for increased emissions of particulate matter. As an EHSA auditor, what is the most effective approach to ensure continued compliance with National Ambient Air Quality Standards, NOx, for particulate matter? Option A. Conduct a comprehensive review of the proposed process changes to identify specific emission points and their potential contribution to ambient concentrations, followed by an assessment of process optimization opportunities to minimize particulate matter generation at the source. Option B. Recommend the installation of advanced baghouse filters on all exhaust stacks to capture particulate matter, regardless of the specific increase in emissions. Option C. Immediately implement enhanced ambient air monitoring around the facility to detect any potential exceedances of NOx for particulate matter. Option D. Rely on the facility's historical record of NOx compliance for particulate matter and assume the proposed changes will not significantly impact ambient air quality. The correct answer is A. Conduct a comprehensive review of the proposed process changes to identify specific emission points and their potential contribution to ambient concentrations, followed by an assessment of process optimization opportunities to minimize particulate matter generation at the source. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common challenge for EHSA auditors, balancing the need for regulatory compliance with the practical realities of industrial operations. The challenge lies in interpreting the nuances of the National Ambient Air Quality Standards, NOx, and determining the most effective and efficient means of achieving and maintaining compliance, especially when faced with potential process changes. The auditor must not only understand the letter of the law, but also its intent and how it applies to evolving industrial processes. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach focuses on a proactive and integrated strategy. It emphasizes understanding the root causes of potential NOx exceedances by analyzing the specific emission sources and their contribution to ambient concentrations. This involves a thorough review of existing monitoring data, process parameters, and emission control technologies. By identifying areas for process optimization, the auditor can recommend changes that not only reduce emissions, but also improve operational efficiency and potentially reduce costs. This aligns with the principles of best available control technology, BACT, and pollution prevention, which are often implicit or explicit in regulatory frameworks aimed at achieving NOx. Ethically, this approach demonstrates due diligence and a commitment to safeguarding public health and the environment through sustainable operational improvements. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach focuses solely on reactive compliance, such as increasing the frequency of monitoring without addressing the underlying emission sources. This fails to address the root cause of potential NOx issues and is an inefficient use of resources. It represents a regulatory failure by not actively seeking to prevent exceedances and an ethical failure by not prioritizing long-term environmental protection. Another incorrect approach involves implementing costly end-of-pipe controls without a thorough assessment of their necessity or effectiveness in relation to the specific NOx pollutants of concern. This can lead to unnecessary financial burdens on the facility and may not be the most efficient or environmentally sound solution. It represents a regulatory failure by potentially overcomplying or misallocating resources, and an ethical failure by not pursuing the most cost-effective and environmentally beneficial solutions. Third incorrect approach is to dismiss potential NOx concerns based on historical compliance data without considering the impact of proposed process changes. This ignores the dynamic nature of industrial operations and the potential for new or increased emissions. It represents a significant regulatory failure by not adequately assessing risks associated with operational changes, and an ethical failure by potentially overlooking future environmental harm. Professional reasoning. EHSA auditors should adopt a systematic risk-based approach. This involves 1. Understanding the relevant NOx pollutants and their sources at the facility. 2. Reviewing historical monitoring data and process information to identify trends and potential issues. 3. Evaluating proposed process changes and their potential impact on emissions. 4. Prioritizing emission reduction strategies based on effectiveness, cost, and environmental benefit, often favoring pollution prevention and process optimization. 5. Documenting all findings and recommendations clearly, with justification tied to regulatory requirements and best practices. Question 16. Market research demonstrates that a manufacturing facility operates in a region with a complex regulatory landscape, including Federal Clean Air Act requirements, state-level air quality standards, and a local county ordinance that imposes stricter emission limits for specific volatile organic compounds, VOC, than either federal or state law. As an EHS auditor tasked with assessing the facility's compliance, which approach best ensures comprehensive and effective environmental auditing? Option A. Focus the audit exclusively on Federal Clean Air Act requirements, as these are the overarching national standards. Option B. Limit the audit scope to verifying compliance only with the emission limits explicitly stated in the facility's current air operating permit. Option C. Assume that state-level air quality standards automatically supersede all local county ordinances regarding VOC emissions. Option D. Prioritize auditing compliance with the most stringent applicable regulation, whether federal, state, or local, to ensure the highest level of environmental protection. The correct answer is D. Prioritize auditing compliance with the most stringent applicable regulation, whether federal, state, or local, to ensure the highest level of environmental protection. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common challenge for environmental, health, and safety auditors, navigating the complex and often overlapping layers of environmental regulation. The presence of federal, state, and local requirements creates a potential for confusion and non-compliance if not meticulously managed. The auditor must discern which regulations are most stringent and therefore take precedence, and how to effectively integrate compliance with all applicable rules into the audit scope. The challenge lies in ensuring comprehensive coverage without creating an unmanageable or redundant audit plan, and in accurately identifying the most protective standards for the environment and public health. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach prioritizes the most stringent applicable regulation. This aligns with the fundamental EHS auditing principle of achieving the highest level of protection. In the United States, This means that if a local ordinance or state law provides a stricter standard than a federal regulation for a particular environmental aspect, e.g., wastewater discharge limits, air emission controls, the auditor must ensure the facility's compliance with that stricter local or state standard. This approach is best professional practice because it guarantees that the facility is not only meeting minimum federal requirements, but also exceeding them where local or state mandates demand it, thereby offering a greater degree of environmental protection and reducing the risk of violations under any tier of regulation. Ethically, it demonstrates a commitment to thoroughness and due diligence in protecting public health and the environment. Incorrect approach is analysis. Focusing solely on federal regulations would be a significant regulatory failure. Federal laws often establish baseline requirements, but they do not preclude states or localities from enacting more protective measures. An auditor who ignores state and local rules risks overlooking violations of these more stringent standards, leading to potential fines, legal action, and environmental harm. This approach is ethically deficient as it fails to ensure the highest achievable level of environmental protection. Assuming state regulations automatically supersede all local ordinances is another regulatory failure. While state laws can preempt certain local actions, they do not universally invalidate all local environmental regulations. Many local ordinances address specific community concerns or environmental conditions that may not be covered by state law, or they may impose stricter controls. An auditor making this assumption could miss critical local compliance obligations. Limiting the audit scope to only those regulations explicitly mentioned in the facility's operating permits is a critical oversight. Operating permits are typically based on federal, state, and local requirements, but they may not encompass every single environmental regulation that applies to a facility's operations. Facilities are subject to a broader range of environmental laws and regulations beyond those detailed in their permits. An auditor who confines their review to permits alone would fail to conduct a comprehensive assessment of compliance. Professional reasoning. When faced with multiple tiers of environmental regulation, an EHS auditor should adopt a hierarchical approach. First, identify all potentially applicable federal, state, and local environmental regulations relevant to the facility's operations. Second, for each environmental aspect being audited, e.g., air emissions, wastewater discharge, hazardous waste management, compare the requirements of each applicable regulatory tier. Third, determine the most stringent standard among the federal, state, and local requirements. Fourth, design the audit scope and procedures to verify compliance with this most stringent standard, while also ensuring that all other applicable, less stringent requirements are also met. This systematic process ensures comprehensive coverage and adherence to the highest level of environmental protection mandated by any governing authority. Question 17. System analysis indicates that a manufacturing facility is experiencing challenges in consistently meeting its Clean Water Act, CWA, discharge permit limits for certain pollutants. As an environmental, health and safety auditor EHSA, tasked with recommending process optimization strategies, which of the following approaches would best align with the principles of the CWA and professional auditing best practices? Option A. Advocating for amendments to the CWA to allow for higher permissible discharge concentrations for the specific pollutants in question. Option B. Focusing on refining the procedures for collecting and analyzing wastewater samples to ensure all data presented in discharge monitoring reports is accurate. Option C. Implementing source reduction techniques and optimizing in-process chemical usage to minimize pollutant generation before wastewater is generated. Option D. Expanding the capacity and upgrading the technology of the existing end-of-pipe wastewater treatment plant. The correct answer is C. Implementing source reduction techniques and optimizing in-process chemical usage to minimize pollutant generation before wastewater is generated. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires an environmental, health and safety auditor, EHSA, to balance regulatory compliance with operational efficiency under the Clean Water Act, CWA. The auditor must identify process optimizations that not only meet stringent discharge limits, but also minimize environmental impact and potential liabilities. The CWA, specifically under U.S. federal law, mandates that point sources discharge pollutants into navigable waters at levels not exceeding the limits established by the EPA or approved state programs. Process optimization in this context is not merely about cost savings. It's about achieving compliance through more sustainable and effective means. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it directly addresses the core objective of the CWA, protecting water quality. By focusing on source reduction and in-process treatment, the auditor is advocating for proactive measures that prevent pollution from occurring or being generated in the first place. This aligns with the CWA's emphasis on preventing pollution and its hierarchy of control, which prioritizes elimination and substitution over end-of-pipe treatment. Such an approach is ethically sound as it demonstrates a commitment to environmental stewardship beyond minimum compliance, reducing the risk of future violations and associated penalties. It also fosters a culture of continuous improvement within the regulated entity. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on increasing the capacity of existing end-of-pipe treatment systems fails to address the root causes of pollution. This is a reactive measure that may achieve compliance in the short term, but is less sustainable and potentially more costly in the long run. It does not embody the spirit of process optimization, which seeks to improve the efficiency and environmental performance of the entire production cycle. Ethically, this approach might be seen as a missed opportunity to implement more environmentally responsible practices. Another incorrect approach that prioritizes modifying discharge monitoring reports without implementing actual process changes is a direct violation of the CWA's reporting requirements and integrity. This constitutes a fraudulent misrepresentation of compliance status, leading to severe legal and ethical repercussions. It undermines the entire regulatory framework designed to protect water resources and demonstrates a clear disregard for both the law and professional integrity. A further incorrect approach that involves lobbying for weaker CWA discharge limits, while potentially offering short-term economic relief, is ethically problematic and professionally irresponsible for an EHSA. The auditor's role is to ensure compliance with existing regulations, not to undermine them. This approach prioritizes economic interest over environmental protection, which is contrary to the fundamental purpose of the CWA and the ethical obligations of an EHSA. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a thorough understanding of the CWA's objectives and specific requirements, a comprehensive assessment of the facility's processes, and the identification of opportunities for improvement that align with the regulatory framework and environmental best practices. This includes evaluating source reduction strategies, in-process modifications, and the effectiveness of existing treatment systems. The auditor must then present a clear, evidence-based recommendation that prioritizes sustainable compliance and environmental protection, while also considering operational feasibility. Question 18. Research into the effectiveness of an emergency response plan during a simulated chemical spill scenario, a manufacturing facility, reveals that, while the documented plan outlines clear evacuation routes and communication protocols, the on-site team struggled to locate essential spill containment equipment and experienced delays in notifying external emergency services due to confusion over the designated communication channel. As an environmental, health, and safety auditor EHSA, what is the most appropriate immediate action to take? Option A. Take over the coordination of the spill response and communication with external agencies to ensure immediate and correct action is taken. Option B. Document the observed discrepancies between the plan and the team's actions for a comprehensive post-exercise report, allowing the simulation to proceed without direct intervention. Option C. Instruct the on-site team to strictly adhere to the documented evacuation routes and communication protocols, even if it leads to further delays, to ensure fidelity to the plan. Option D. Immediately direct the on-site team to utilize the most readily available spill containment materials and establish a direct communication line to external services, while noting the procedural deviations for post-exercise review. The correct answer is D. Immediately direct the on-site team to utilize the most readily available spill containment materials and establish a direct communication line to external services, while noting the procedural deviations for post-exercise review. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires an environmental, health and safety auditor, EHSA, to navigate the practical implementation of an emergency response plan, ERP, in a dynamic and potentially chaotic situation, rather than just reviewing documentation. The auditor must assess the effectiveness of the plan in real time, considering human factors, resource availability, and communication breakdowns, which are often difficult to predict or simulate perfectly. Careful judgment is required to distinguish between minor deviations and critical failures that could compromise safety. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes the immediate safety of personnel and the environment by focusing on the actual execution of the ERP. This aligns with the overarching goal of EHSA regulations, which are designed to prevent harm and ensure preparedness for foreseeable emergencies. By actively observing and intervening where necessary to ensure adherence to established procedures, the auditor is fulfilling their ethical and professional duty to uphold safety standards. This proactive stance is crucial for identifying gaps in training, equipment, or communication that might not be apparent during a desk review. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on the documented procedures without assessing their practical application is professionally unacceptable. This represents a regulatory failure because it overlooks the core purpose of an ERP, which is to guide actions during an emergency. Ethically, it fails to ensure the well-being of those potentially affected by the emergency. Another incorrect approach, which involves making significant, unapproved modifications to the ERP during the event, is also professionally unacceptable. This constitutes a regulatory failure as it bypasses established change control processes and could introduce unforeseen risks or conflicts with existing protocols. Ethically, it undermines the authority of the plan and could lead to confusion and further endanger personnel. A third incorrect approach, which is to defer all decision-making to on-site management without independent auditor assessment, is a failure to exercise professional judgment. This is a regulatory and ethical lapse, as the auditor has a responsibility to independently verify the effectiveness of safety measures, not merely observe their implementation by others. Professionals should use a decision-making framework that involves 1. Understanding the documented ERP thoroughly. 2. Observing the actual response against the documented plan. 3. Identifying deviations and assessing their impact on safety. 4. Communicating findings and recommendations clearly and promptly to relevant parties. And 5. Ensuring that any interventions are proportionate and aligned with the overall safety objectives. Question 19. The assessment process reveals a pattern of minor breaches across multiple health and safety procedures, indicating a potential systemic failure in the company's safety management system rather than isolated incidents. Given this, what is the most appropriate enforcement procedure to initiate under the UK regulatory framework? Option A. Immediately pursue prosecution for multiple breaches of health and safety regulations. Option B. Issue a verbal warning to the site manager and suggest informal improvements. Option C. Document the findings in the audit report and rely on the company's internal audit process for resolution. Option D. Issue an improvement notice detailing the systemic issues and requiring specific corrective actions within a reasonable timeframe. Correct answer is D. Issue an improvement notice detailing the systemic issues and requiring specific corrective actions within a reasonable timeframe. Explanation. Scenario analysis. The scenario presents a common challenge for an environmental, health and safety auditor, EHSA, where a significant noncompliance is identified during an assessment. The challenge lies in determining the appropriate enforcement procedure when a company exhibits a pattern of minor infractions that, while individually not severe, collectively indicate a systemic issue and a potential disregard for regulatory requirements. The auditor must balance the need for immediate corrective action with the long-term goal of fostering a culture of compliance. This requires careful judgment to ensure the enforcement action is proportionate, effective, and legally sound, avoiding both overreach and under-enforcement. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves initiating a formal enforcement procedure that escalates based on the identified systemic issues and the company's response. This aligns with the principles of regulatory enforcement, which often advocate for a graduated response. For the UK, this would typically involve referencing the Health and Safety at Work, etc. Act 1974, EHSA, and relevant approved codes of practice, a CO-PS, or guidance from the Health and Safety Executive, EHSA. The initial step would be to issue an improvement notice, requiring specific actions to rectify the systemic issues within a defined timeframe. If the company fails to comply or demonstrates a lack of commitment to improvement, further enforcement actions, such as a prohibition notice or prosecution, would be warranted. This approach ensures that the enforcement is targeted, allows the company an opportunity to rectify the issues, and provides a clear pathway for escalation if compliance is not achieved, thereby promoting sustained improvement and protecting worker safety. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach would be to simply document the findings in the audit report and rely solely on the company's internal audit process to address the issues. This fails to acknowledge the potential for systemic failure and the auditor's responsibility to ensure regulatory compliance. Ethically and regulatorily, this approach abdicates the auditor's duty to report and act upon significant noncompliances, potentially leaving workers at risk and violating the spirit of the EHSA, which places a duty on employers to ensure health and safety. Another incorrect approach would be to immediately pursue the most severe enforcement action, such as prosecution, without first attempting a more proportionate measure like an improvement notice. While the pattern of noncompliance is concerning, immediate prosecution may be disproportionate if the company has not been given a clear opportunity to rectify the systemic issues. This could be seen as an overreach of authority and may not foster a collaborative approach to compliance, potentially leading to resistance rather than genuine improvement. It also bypasses the established graduated enforcement framework often favored by regulatory bodies. A third incorrect approach would be to issue a warning without a formal notice and without setting clear deadlines for corrective actions. A verbal warning or an informal note in the report lacks the legal standing and enforceability of a formal notice. This approach does not create a legally binding obligation for the company to act and does not provide a clear basis for further enforcement if the issues persist. It undermines the authority of the audit process and the regulatory framework, as it does not compel the necessary changes. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a systematic approach to enforcement. This involves 1. Thoroughly documenting all identified noncompliances and assessing their severity and potential impact. 2. Evaluating whether the noncompliances indicate a systemic issue or a pattern of disregard for regulations. 3. Consulting relevant regulatory guidance and legal frameworks, e.g. EHSA 1974 in the UK, to determine the appropriate enforcement options. 4. Prioritizing a graduated enforcement strategy, starting with measures that allow for rectification and escalating if necessary. 5. Clearly communicating findings and required actions to the company, ensuring they understand the implications of noncompliance. 6. Maintaining objective records of all communications and actions taken. Question 20. Governance review demonstrates that a new industrial facility is in the final stages of planning, with construction imminent. The environmental auditor is tasked with assessing the potential environmental impacts of this facility. Which approach to environmental impact assessment best aligns with regulatory requirements and best professional practice for this stage of the project? Option A. Focus the environmental impact assessment solely on air emissions and wastewater discharge, as these are the most easily quantifiable environmental parameters. Option B. Initiate the environmental impact assessment during the construction phase, prioritizing the identification of immediate site-specific issues as they arise. Option C. Postpone the detailed environmental impact assessment until after the facility has been operational for 1 year, relying on general industry environmental performance data for initial planning. Option D. Conduct a comprehensive environmental impact assessment that considers all potential direct, indirect, and cumulative impacts, integrating findings into the final project design and operational plans before construction commences. The correct answer is D. Conduct a comprehensive environmental impact assessment that considers all potential direct, indirect, and cumulative impacts, integrating findings into the final project design and operational plans before construction commences. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge because the auditor must balance the need for comprehensive environmental impact assessment with the practical constraints of an ongoing project. The auditor's judgment is critical in determining the appropriate level of detail and the timing of the assessment to ensure it is both effective and timely, without unduly delaying essential project activities. The potential for conflicting stakeholder interests, e.g., project developers versus environmental regulators, adds another layer of complexity. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it aligns with the principles of proactive environmental management and regulatory compliance. Conducting a focused impact assessment during the planning phase allows for the identification and mitigation of potential environmental risks before they materialize. This aligns with the precautionary principle often embedded in environmental legislation, which advocates for taking preventive action in the face of uncertainty. Furthermore, integrating the assessment into the project lifecycle ensures that environmental considerations are not an afterthought but are systematically addressed, leading to more sustainable outcomes and reducing the likelihood of costly remediation or legal challenges later. This approach also supports the auditor's role in providing assurance on the effectiveness of environmental management systems. Incorrect approaches analysis. An approach that delays the impact assessment until after construction has commenced is professionally unacceptable. This represents a significant regulatory failure, as many environmental laws require impact assessments to be completed and approved before significant project activities begin. Ethically, it demonstrates a disregard for due diligence and the potential for irreversible environmental damage. It shifts the burden of identification and mitigation to a stage where it is far more difficult and expensive, potentially leading to non-compliance and reputational damage. An approach that relies solely on historical data without considering project-specific impacts is also professionally unacceptable. While historical data can provide context, it is insufficient for a proper impact assessment of a new or modified project. Environmental conditions change, and project activities have unique footprints. Failing to conduct a project-specific assessment is a regulatory failure because it does not meet the requirements of most environmental impact assessment frameworks, which mandate an evaluation of the specific effects of the proposed undertaking. Ethically, it is a failure of professional responsibility to provide an accurate and relevant assessment. An approach that focuses only on readily quantifiable environmental impacts, ignoring qualitative or indirect effects, is professionally deficient. Many environmental regulations and auditing standards require consideration of a broad range of impacts, including those that are harder to measure but still significant, such as biodiversity loss, landscape changes, or community disruption. Ignoring these aspects can lead to an incomplete and misleading assessment, potentially violating the spirit and letter of environmental protection laws. Ethically, it represents a failure to conduct a thorough and holistic evaluation, potentially overlooking critical environmental concerns. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a risk-based approach, prioritizing assessments that address the most significant potential environmental impacts early in the project lifecycle. This involves understanding the specific regulatory requirements for environmental impact assessment in the relevant jurisdiction, consulting with stakeholders, and employing appropriate methodologies to identify, predict, and evaluate potential environmental effects. The auditor must exercise professional skepticism and judgment to ensure the assessment is comprehensive, accurate, and timely, providing valuable insights for decision-making and compliance assurance.